In this presentation, we're going to look at experiments, and in particular, the different types of experiments that we use in psychology. So experiments are all about establishing causal relationships. So they're all about cause and effect. So a situation is set up by the researcher, and the researcher then watches and records what happens. All experiments have an independent variable known as the IV, which is the variable you manipulate to see what the effect is on the dependent variable, the DV. So there is another presentation that you'll find on the YouTube channel that explains all about hypotheses writing and goes into more details about independent variables and dependent variables, but it's a thing that you really need to understand in order to further your study of psychology. One of the key things is operationalizing your variables. Operationalizing just means being very clear exactly what your IV and DV are and making sure that they are stated in a measurable form. So if we look at an example here, if we had a very vague aim of time of day will affect memory, the IV is time of day, but we'd need to operationalise it. So what do we mean by time of day? So we'd need to think about our two conditions of our independent variable. So it might be morning 9 o'clock, afternoon 3 p.m. And our dependent variable, our effect, is what we're measuring. So in this case, memory, but memory is quite a vague term. We need to be more precise. How are we going to measure memory? And the most common way is to do a simple memory test using a list of words. So it might be number of words recalled from a list of 20. We can then put those IVs and DVs into our alternative hypotheses, also known as the experimental hypotheses, which is our prediction of what we expect to happen. So in this case, there will be a significant difference in the recall of 20 common words between participants who complete the task in the morning, 9 a.m., and those that complete the task in the afternoon, 3 p.m. So we've had a non-directional hypothesis. We haven't specified which group we expect to remember more words. And that actually is good practice unless there's been previous research. So always use a non-directional hypothesis unless there's been previous research. And then our null hypotheses, there will be no significant difference in recall of a list of 20 common words between participants who complete the task in the morning and those that complete the task in the afternoon. Any difference is due to chance. And remember that due to chance makes more sense when we start to talk about significant testing in psychology, because remember, we expect at least 95% of our results to go the way we predicted in order to reject the null hypotheses. As well as independent variables and dependent variables, there are things called extraneous variables. What these are other factors that could affect the outcome or could have an influence on the dependent variable other than the independent variable. So the most common of these are things like demand characteristics, social desirability, investigator effects, and individual differences. And extraneous variables can usually be classified as situational or individual. As a researcher, when we're designing research, what we need to do is try and control those extraneous variables as much as possible. Now, there are several ways we can do that. One way is standardization, and what that means is we keep the environment, all the instructions, everything about the experiment exactly the same for each and every participant, so it's standardized. So if there are any extraneous variables, they'll be affecting all the participants in the same way. The other way we control for individual extraneous variables is through our experimental design. So we might have repeated measures where we have all the participants doing all the conditions, or matched pairs where similar participants do each condition. Now, if we're using a repeated measures design, one of the important things to do is counterbalancing. So the first participant does task A followed by task B, and the next one does task B followed by task A. That is to counterbalance for practice and order effects. It's known as the ABBA technique, because AB, BA. Or we could use randomization, and what we do then, instead of having a system of A, B, B, A, we simply flick a coin. Heads, you do condition A first, tails, you do condition B first. And again, it's all about cancelling out these practice and order effects. If extraneous variables are not controlled, then they become confounding variables. The difference is tense. Extraneous before, confounding afterwards. If you've not controlled them, they become a confounding variable, and then you'd need to talk about them in your evaluation of your research by saying, situational variables were a problem because they weren't controlled. So that's the difference between extraneous variables and confounding variables. They're the same thing, but extraneous is the ones you try and control. They become confounding variables if you didn't manage to control them. The most common type of experiment that people tend to think of is a laboratory experiment. Remember, by laboratory, we're talking about a controlled environment. So what this does is it gives the psychologist a really high level of control. They can control all the situational variables. And a good example would be Loftus and Palmer's study on the effect of leading questions on memory. That's a good example of a lab experiment. Now, as we've said, the good things is you've got complete control over your variables. They also force the pace of the research because the researcher is completely in control. They're easy to replicate, which makes them reliable, and we can get quantitative data that's easy to analyse. We're also able to use technical equipment, so Loftus was able to show her participants footage of car crashes. The problems though, and the major problem with a lab experiment, is loss of validity. It's not real life. So we also always talk about them lacking ecological validity. So in Loftus and Palmer's example, watching a slideshow of a car crash is very different to experiencing one in real life because you're giving it your full attention and there's no emotion involved. We've got the drawbacks of the experimental design. So if you design a poor experiment, you'll get poor results. We've got demand characteristics. Participants might guess the aim and act differently. We've got issues about sampling bias. Are our participants representative? And we might have ethical concerns as well, depending on the study that we're undertaking. One of the ways we get around this criticism that experiments don't accurately reflect real life is by carrying out research in a natural environment. These are known as field experiments, so research is carried out in the field. And a good example of that is Pilyarvin's Subway Samaritan study that was carried out on the New York subway. So our advantages, of course, they're far more ecologically valid, and they still force the pace of the research because the researcher's manipulating a situation. They're fairly easy to replicate, but not as easy as lab experiments. And again, we can get quantitative data. Our problem, though, is we haven't really got control over situational variables. It's much more of an issue. We've still got all the other issues that we had with lab experiments: drawback of design, demand characteristics, sampling bias, ethics, and we're less likely to be able to use technical equipment in the field. Natural experiments, not to be muddled with field experiments. The confusion arises because field experiments take place in a natural environment, but natural experiments are not to do with the environment, they're to do with the IV. So in a natural experiment, the IV is not manipulated by the researcher. What they do is take advantage of something that's already happened, and it's usually an event. So for example, if a school was bringing in a new reading scheme, you could compare the reading ages of children on the new reading scheme with a similar school and see what theirs were like. Or the example I've given here, the effects of a tsunami on future mental illness. So for example, when there was the tsunami in Thailand, you could have looked at how many people were admitted or had treatment for mental illness before the tsunami and how many afterwards to see if there was any change. So the IV is a naturally occurring event. It's something that would have happened whether the research was taking part or not. Another example was in Fiji when TV was introduced, so they looked at how eating disorders suddenly ramped up once people were exposed to thin role models in the media. A quasi-experiment, again, the IV is not manipulated by the researcher, it occurs naturally, but this time the IV is a participant variable, so it's things like age or gender. Those are the groups. So if you wanted to look at whether males were more aggressive than females, that would be a quasi-experiment because people already were male or female. So strictly speaking, this method is not experimental, but you'll still see examples of this. So in quasi-experiments, we've got a reduction of demand characteristics. There's a lack of direct intervention, which makes it all a lot more natural. But of course, we haven't got control over those variables because they occurred naturally. Thank you for listening. Please make sure you read the relevant chapters or pages in your textbook and look at past paper questions as well to see what sort of thing you might be asked.